Okay, good morning. How is everybody? I hope well. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. I am also the executive director for the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host organization for today. Some of you will know the role of the Georgetown Center, but if you don't, the goal of the center is to generate ideas, to convene leaders, and to shape policy on issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy. Now, today we have an event, the title of which is From Ideology to Practicalities, Policies to Stimulate the 21st Century Economy. Now, it may be entirely obvious to you why that title exists and what the motivation for today is, but let me just emphasize to you the thinking on this. And it is this, that we have just gone through a fall political season of ideological posturing, and sometimes it has been very divisive. The election is over, it's in the rearview mirror, and now we have the opportunity, indeed the mandate, to govern. And unlike the political season, governing is something where practicalities and rolling up our sleeves is valued much more than political posturing. So the notion today is to have a series of discussions that is drawn from good, solid academic research around two areas. What do we know? What do we know? What set of policies can we comfortably move forward on from the academic sector knowing certain things? So you policymakers are going to hear lots of things. What we'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we know. But then we also have some things that we still need to know about, and I'd like to have that discussion as well. To do that, we have assembled a set of the Georgetown Center Senior Policy Scholars who have each spent their entire professional lives, they're all economists, have spent their professional lives studying particular areas. And what we're going to do is ask each one of them to speak for a relatively short period of time. Everybody's going to have an opportunity for questions and answers, but to speak about their particular area. What we've got is the first panel will take on broad issues, the macro economy and international trade. The second panel will be a more specific discussion on telecommunications and internet policy, on innovation policy, and on energy and the environment. We're very excited about this discussion. I think it's going to be quick in each one of those cases. We hope to come back at you later and do deeper dives on each one of those particular areas that may be of particular interest to you. Now, this morning, we are just tickled to death to have with us Senator Mark Warner, who really needs no introduction to this particular audience. He's familiar to all of you as a leading member of the United States Senate. But the invitation to Senator Warner was purposeful. It was not just random. The invitation went to Senator Warner because I think among people in the United States Senate, he is perhaps the single senator that most embodies the check your ideology at the door, let's roll up our sleeves and get the job done approach to governance. So Senator Warner has agreed to keynote this event and also to take some questions. Please help me welcome Senator Mark Warner.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I particularly appreciate the fact that we managed to schedule this right around the hall from my office and right downstairs where I do my next interview right after this. I want to say hello to Rob and other friends who I've had the chance to work with over the years. I thought that I would kind of give you a quick overview of about 6 different items that I think are key to kind of how we move ahead. How do we get this economy going? What do we do kind of post-election? And then, as time allows, recognize I've got to do an interview about 10 o'clock, try to take time for questions. Particularly appreciate John's introduction of me saying, you know, here's this guy, Warner, who is the leading advocate of moving past partisanship and kind of working together. You know, look how successful I've been. This stuff shouldn't be this hard, and I, as somebody who's spent a career, still longer time of a career in business than I have in politics, and was in the telecommunications industry, was in the venture capital business, and then spent 4 years as governor, to come here where it seems like everything still breaks down on team sports basis. You're either on the red team or the blue team, is a bit disturbing. And one of the things I just doesn't affect directly the topic, but I think it indirectly does, because if we are going to get to the level of true policy, compromise, and moving forward, one of the things that's actually even surprised me as someone who came to this job, relatively well-informed American citizen. I'd been a governor, so I thought I knew the political system. I didn't fully appreciate until I got here how little institutional support there is for that kind of finding common ground, bipartisan solution set. Everybody says they're for it, but none of the institutional forces in Washington are supportive of it. There is no institutional entity here, and until recently, this effort around the so-called campaign to fix the debt, that actually says we're going to support people who try to find common ground. We get a lot of kind of attaboys and attagirls, but in terms of tangible, realistic support, the kind of milk of politics in terms of financial support or people really being there, everything is the opposite. All of the financial resources are mostly given towards people who are more reinforcing their party label. The interest groups that come forward are always, make at least some passing reference to the greater good, but then say, let me tell you why that doesn't affect my particular program, tax expenditure, or other policy. And one of the things that would be, I think, a useful, a useful discussion, not just for this group, but at a broader level, is how do we move past the kind of editorial support for people finding common ground, for checking your Republican, Democrat hats at the door after an election, to actually having an institutional support basis for that kind of policy. That would be a subject of another. Let me get to the question at hand. What can we do, intersection between public policy and jump-starting this economy? Let me give you 6 items, top line. Won't go into a lot of detail on all of them, but we can come back on questions that I think can help us move this economy forward. Overview before I get to the 6 are that our economy is so complex. Our economy is so deep and broad at this point that sometimes policymakers, I think, get caught up in their own particular area and think there is that one single silver bullet that is going to allow the economy to roar ahead. I personally don't believe that. I think that the fact that we have built a diverse, internationally based, enormously, with all our challenges, robust economy means that there is no single silver bullet. But there are things that policymakers can do to either help or hurt an economy moving forward, particularly at this moment in time after we are coming out of whatever terminology we want to use it, the Great Recession, the biggest recession since the Depression, the financial crisis, the breakdown of Wall Street, all those things. So we are at a point where we can, I think, take some bolder policy initiatives. So what are those 6 items? I'm going to start with the one that most folks probably wouldn't put at the top of their list, but I do, and again, let me preface this with the fact that, as some folks, and even Kathy and others in this room know, I have become a bit obsessed about the... Come on in, we can come in the other way. Full-service public official here, I have become a bit obsessed about the debt and deficit issue. That is obviously gets a lot of attention. And there's a whole host of reasons in terms of negative, what happens if we fall off the fiscal cliff. Why I put debt and deficit as one of our issues to jumpstart the national economy and I put it literally near the top, is that while we look at all of our challenges and all of the negative consequences if we go over the cliff, what we haven't focused on is all the positive aspects if we actually put a real deal together that starts to take a meaningful chunk, and by meaningful chunk I'd say at least $4 trillion out of our $16 trillion debt over the next decade. So I would put it the number one thing that we can do in a post-campaign climate to jumpstart our economy is to actually get a meaningful debt and deficit deal. And the reason I say that is because if you take a quick, at least again, quick survey of the world economy right now, America's economy looks pretty darn good. While our growth rates are only roughly around 2%, if you look compared to the rest of the world, 2% with a mature economy is again, relatively good at this moment in time. Europe, as we all know, is in crisis. China is going through leadership transition and has actually had, quarter-over-quarter net declines over the last 3 or 4 quarters. India, where I'm proud to be chairman of the U.S.-India Senate Caucus, actually has as equally a dysfunctional, if not more politically dysfunctional system than ours. You've seen the emerging, kind of roaring economies of economy like Brazil in the first quarter. Now we're getting into it, we'll soon see the third quarter results, but first quarter results in Brazil, net negative decline. And while there are individual countries that are doing well, America is still the bulwark of driving the world's economy. And as investors with still close to $2 trillion in private sector capital that's sitting on the sidelines are looking for places to invest, the United States looks pretty damn good. If we have the political wherewithal to put a major debt and deficit deal in place. And one of the things that, again, frustrates me when we look at these choices, to do a $4 trillion deal, $4 to $5 trillion deal, recognizing that we've got about almost $1 trillion of cuts already made, recognizing that any deal of that scope will have baked into it at least $500 billion in interest savings over a decade. That slims the actual revenue increases and cuts to the, $2.5 trillion range. When you look at the fact that the revenue that the president is talking about putting back in at $1.6 trillion over 10 years is only a third of the size of the Bush tax cuts. So nobody's even talking about going back to the tax rates that Rob and his colleagues did during the 90s, where most of us did pretty darn well in this country. When you look at what is being asked of the American people in a moderate-sized deal in comparison to what's being asked in people anywhere across the world, as they grapple and come out of the financial crisis. This is so much exponentially smaller, a roughly $4 to $4.5 trillion deal over 10 years than what's being asked not only people of Europe, the UK, the transitions going on in China and elsewhere, that one, it shouldn't be this hard, and two, if we were to put this in place, the economic upside benefit in terms of jump-starting an economy that no matter how much we keep trying to kind of, with policy uncertainty, throttle back, is ready to go forward. I personally believe that getting this right is more important and would be a greater economic boost and job generator than, quite candidly, any single item that Governor Romney or President Obama talked about during the presidential campaign. So first and foremost, I'd put the debt and deficit issue up. I want to then take, kind of building off John's comments, 3 suggestions around specific issue areas for my next 3 points, around energy, around kind of telecom, internet, and around trade. Let's start with energy. First of all, it would be, I think, enormously important if America actually had an energy policy. What we have right now is a mishmash of policies that are an overhang from the 70s and 80s, a little bit of a movement in the 90s, but, a recognition and acknowledgement that, climate change is coming and we have to deal with it, a recognition and an acknowledgement that that we can never fully predict where innovation is going to come. Who would have predicted a decade ago that natural gas would have the kind of explosive, transformative power it has brought to this economy right now? But a realistic, forward-leaning energy policy that recognizes some of the externalities that are brought about by some of the fossil fuels, that puts in place policies that promote some of the lowest hanging fruit, energy efficiency or energy productivity. I think maybe a better way to talk about efficiency, you can call it productivity rather than the notion of conservation, which means you've got to kind of restrict. We ought to think about productivity. And while I am a all of the above supporter in terms of additional gas, oil, I believe that we still can't give up on coal. It needs to be a piece of the equation. But we also have to look at the alternatives. We have to look at fuel. We have to look at, solar. We have to look at the other renewables in terms of wind, biofuels. I do think corn-based ethanol is probably one of the loser technologies. It's time to move beyond that. I think nuclear's got to be part of the mix, but a comprehensive energy 21st century energy policy would be something that I think could, one, give us predictability around the energy markets. Two, as we look at the possibility that America, from both the natural gas and actually oil side, if we think about it in a way, may be one of the world's leading producers rather than importers. If we really put a little more shoulder into development of the renewables, and I'm a strong believer in those. I actually created a venture fund in the renewable energy space between being governor and senator that candidly has not done that well, just as most all the others have not done that well with the with the absence of having a regulatory framework that was expected with the cap and trade and with the upsurge of natural gas. But that doesn't mean we're still not going to need to get to these additional energy sources. But energy policy is one that I would put as an area that we need focus on. Next, and I'll come back again, I wasn't going to mention this, but when John said let's talk about telecom and the internet, we still are the leaders in those technologies. But what is holding America back and where we're about to lose our leadership position, and I say this biased as the co-founder of Nextel, which makes me, again, the only politician that says leave your cell phones on even when I'm speaking. Doesn't bother me at all. But I think we need to, this leadership position we've had in telecom and internet, I think needs to, we can't sit upon it. And the two specific subset items that I think we need to address within telecom and internet are, one, we need to push the edge on additional spectrum allocation. We've taken some policy positions in terms of trying to move some of our broadcasters to incent them to give up spectrum. That's a move in the right direction. It would help as well if we could actually even do something as simple as a spectrum inventory of what parts of the federal government are underutilizing spectrum. Spectrum is the coin of the realm in wireless technology. Wireless technology and mobile apps are not simply about using your iPhone better, but really is, I think, going to be the area where health IT has an enormous expansion opportunity as we move more into education technology, as we move more into a whole host of other applications. Spectrum is the key. So unleashing and quicker licensing process to additional spectrum would be one area that I think we need more investment in and more public policy action. And then the other, the corollary to that a little bit, is an area that unfortunately I think is going to be an enormous growth area, and it is at least tangentially connected to kind of internet policy, and that comes into the question of cybersecurity. If the American public realized how many times a day, not just our critical infrastructure institutions, but our private intellectual property is raided and ripped off, if the American public realized how much money is filtered out of the banking system each and every day, you would be aghast. And if there is going to be the appropriate kind of public-private partnerships, the kind of safety protocols that are needed, if we're going to make, even if we free up the spectrum, if we have an internet that is not safe and secure, then the ability to kind of transact the commerce, but also the free flow of information that's needed will be seriously diminished. So from a policy perspective, we need to move on cybersecurity as well. The fourth item that I want to mention is trade. We all say we live in a global economy. We all pay lip service to that. Quite honestly, the American economy for the 20th century at least was remarkably not good at exporting items. Our Fortune 100 companies were great, but the balance of our kind of economic infrastructure was pretty much an insular economy. And the reason was that if you have the world's biggest economy in a large-scale country like America, and you were a small to mid-size American business, you didn't need to figure out how to trade internationally. You had the biggest banana to work with. Other countries, you think about kind of the enormous growth of a German economy and others, while an enormously large economy. If you're a German mid-sized business, the only way you could really do business and grow is you had to learn to trade. American businesses have not had to do that. And one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that no matter what size business you are, 95% of all your future customers are going to be international. We live in a mature market. So how we as policymakers can do two things. One, continue to move forward on trade agreements. And it was good that we moved forward recently on Colombia, Peru, and Korea. But the whole Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you guys want to come on forward, don't have to stand up in there. But move forward on trade agreements is something that I think ought to be an area where there should be some commonality. And part of that trade agreements will mean, and I'm a big believer in trade, but do believe that trade needs to be coupled with some level of level playing field, and particularly with nations like China where this has turned into a one-way street where they steal our IP, they don't adhere to the environmental and worker protection rules that the rest of the world lives with. We're going to need some trade enforcement as we expand trade, but I think trade agreements are one important component. And then coupled with that, with the question of trade agreements, comes the idea of how we, from policymakers' standpoint, try to assist businesses navigate trade. If you're a small or mid-sized company in America today, and you say, okay, I want to try to sell my products into China, into Australia, into Brazil, I mean, it is a nightmare sorting through what kind of governmental assistance you might get. Think about our governmental structures for trade. We have a Commerce Department that is actually more than half the Commerce Department is the National Oceanic and Atmospheres Administration. Important entity, not necessarily right in the center of commerce. If you're trying to look at trade functions, they're split within commerce. They're split within the United States Trade Representative, which is in the Office of the Presidency, where they're split between independent agencies like the Export-Import Bank and OPIC. These are the areas that give the kind of loan guarantees and financial protections if you're trading with a country that might have some political risk. And then that's supplemented sometimes with state economic development efforts. It is a total mishmash. One of the things that President Obama suggested last year didn't put much oomph behind it, and it died a quick death here on the Hill, but the notion of trying to consolidate all our trade functions into an easier, more user-friendly single access point, I think needs to be revisited in, how we help small and mid-sized companies navigate the opportunities around trade, terribly important. So you need trade agreements, but even once you get the agreement, if you're going to try to make those opportunities open to more than just the Fortune 100 companies, you're going to need to figure out ways that governmental assistance can be cleaner, more streamlined, and more tailored to help small and mid-sized companies. So debt and deficit deal, telecom-related spectrum, and cybersecurity, energy policy that's rational, trying to navigate trade. The last 2 points, and these are, I think, fall at the macroeconomic level, and they're areas that I've been very involved in, and that is how we continue to grow an innovation economy. One of the things that is some great data, and John, I don't know if you've seen this, but the Kauffman Foundation did some really good work over the last couple of years and came out with data that said, Rob, minimum of 80% of all net new jobs that have been created in America in the last 30 years have come from startup enterprises. That's a pretty stunning statistic, and there's even been some that have said that it's more closer to 100%. And that what's kind of wild about that from a policy perspective is that means that on a net basis, Fortune 500 companies, the large brand name companies, have basically created zero net new jobs. Yet big, large-scale companies have their presence up here on the Hill, ably represented by trade associations, by lobbyists, and by others. The other side of the equation, small business, which every American politician loves to sing the wonders and glory of small business, and I'm all for small business as well. But again, traditional small business, in the sense of the hardware store or the beauty shop or the auto mechanic, they've added net zero new jobs over the last 30 years as well. And small business, which is ably represented here on the Hill as well. We're here in the Small Business Conference Room. The folks that are actually creating the jobs, the startups, and we normally think about startups in the context of tech firms, but I would point out whether it's Under Armour or Chipotle or some of these new yogurt companies, it can be across a series of fields. They virtually have no voice in the policy discussions. And if we're going to help startup businesses move forward, it really comes down and win this kind of innovation global economy struggle, it comes down to two secret ingredients around entrepreneurs. I say this as somebody who was an entrepreneur myself and then a venture capitalist for 20 years, funding entrepreneurs. In this kind of world economy, we can't decide what's going to foment the ideas other than, our great university systems, and again, I believe in support of those, but it really, from a policy perspective, comes down to access to capital and access to talent. And what can we do in those two areas? On access to capital, we got a lot of challenges. I spent, again, a number of years as a venture capitalist. I was very active in the go-go 90s days when not only venture capital was expanding dramatically, the markets were wide open in terms of ability to take companies public, maybe too wide open when we think about the dot-com boom, but there were the growth of these angel networks and others. The financial crisis came, and most of that stuff came to a dead halt. The amount of venture capital has dramatically decreased. Angel networks, for the most part, have disappeared, and until recently, access to the public markets with the appropriate legislative response after the dot-com boom, but said, let's tighten up on the ability to go public with Sarbanes-Oxley, really meant the access to capital issue has become a real problem. Couple that with the fact that traditional financing sources, banks and others, even 4 years after the financial crisis, are still not lending into particularly startup entities. So what do we do? Well, on the access to capital, I've got some good news. There was a bill passed last year called the Jobs Act, a bill that 98% of Americans have never heard of, that was built off legislation I had, Startup 1.0, and it actually does two significant things in this access to capital area. One, it removes a lot of the regulatory hurdles for those companies who want to go public by kind of cutting back on some of the overreach, perhaps, that came out of Sarbanes-Oxley. It also allows a series of other kind of regulatory changes for raising capital and in the process of going public. That's great at one end of the business cycle, if you're a small business that's gotten successful enough to go public. At the other end, and this is an area that if I was 23 again, that I might go into full time, we are opening up the power of the internet to raise private equity capital through crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. This is going to be the wild, wild west. The SEC is working on the regulations right now. And they're not going to get it 100% right. How do you get the balance so you don't have people scamming folks? But at the same time, think about the ability that if you've got a small, cool idea and you want to raise in $5,000 or $10,000 chunks or more from qualified investors, the ability to market over the internet offers an enormous opportunity. Where this is particularly potentially powerful is in small markets and rural communities that don't have any angel networks, don't have any venture capital, and this could trickle down to restaurants, it could trickle down to kind of more locally based enterprises. It doesn't have to be the next Google that would be raising capital this way, but enormously powerful if we get it right. And we have to get the regulatory balance right, but I would again point out that one of the things that the internet has done pretty well is self-police, because who would have thought a decade ago that we would be trading billions of dollars or trading billions of dollars of goods over an entity like eBay with relatively little regulatory oversight. So access to capital is one. Final is access to talent. And and I'm very happy to see post-election that we're starting to move into the immigration space. Let me talk about some low-hanging fruit in that area. That again, I've got legislation with Marco Rubio and Chris Coons and Jerry Moran called Startup 2.0, and it's a series of visa changes, but there are two in particular that I want to highlight, so I can at least get a couple of questions in before.
Really fast here on your
Okay. And that is, one, to create a visa for those graduate students in the STEM fields, foreign graduate students in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, who receive at least a master's or PhD. Now listen, I wish we had all of those slots filled by native-born Americans. We don't. And matter of fact, if we had the immigration policies in place in the 80s and 90s that we do today, we would have never had an Intel or a Google, or in an area like Northern Virginia where a third of all of our tech firms have first-generation Americans as one of their founders or co-founders. It makes absolutely no sense in a global economy for us to train the world's best and brightest people in these fields that are job generators and then send them home. So we would create a whole new STEM visa category, and then we couple that, and everybody's for that. The second part of this, which is a little more problematic, is that those folks who are foreign-born individuals working in America on H-1B visas, a lot of the big name companies have folks on those kind of visas. What the dirty little secret about those visas are, they're really almost involuntary servitude contracts. Because if you're working for Microsoft, or if you're working for Google and you're this brilliant Indian computer scientist, you can't leave employment of that company without being threat of being sent home. So what we would create is an entrepreneur visa that says if you're able to go out and we put a fairly low threshold, $100,000, and raise it and hire a couple of Americans, we're going to give you a chance to get out of that H-1B involuntary servitude aspect and actually go become an entrepreneur in this country. If we again go back to that data, all the jobs, net new jobs, are being created by startups. If we don't win the battle in terms of access to capital, and if we don't win the equally important, if not more important battle, access to talent, we're not going to be successful. So, debt and deficit, internet and technology, energy, trade, and then I think the macro pieces of how we compete and win in this innovation economy. It's all about capital. It's all about talent. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.